If I were to encapsulate my existence in Easton, it would mirror this scenario. I lead a tranquil life, residing in a peaceful house within a serene community. My name is Martin. I'm 54 years old, and I've called this place home for over 30 years. My residence isn't anything extravagant. It's a modest, single-story, three-bedroom house situated on a street populated with similar dwellings. It's the kind of neighborhood where one could easily blend in if not paying close attention. I relocated here in the early 1990s, right after the real estate downturn. During that period, property values were volatile, and like many others, I secured a bargain that was too good to pass up. Initially, I anticipated nothing more than having a secure place to live, but over time, this small part of Easton transformed into my refuge. My home has its peculiarities, occasional squeaky floorboards and the like, but the aspect I cherish most is my garden. It's not an expansive estate, just a well-maintained backyard featuring a few vegetable plots and rose bushes that I've diligently cared for over countless hours. Additionally, there's a small above-ground pool. It's simple, but on a sweltering summer day, it provides all the relief I need. My daily routine is consistent. I rise early, tend to the plants, enjoy a cup of coffee, and sit quietly watching birds flit by. The neighborhood has always been calm. No conflicts, no excessive noise, no unwelcome disturbances. My neighbors are amicable, yet we largely keep to ourselves. I'm not fond of large gatherings or significant social events. I exchange nods and greetings when I'm out walking or grabbing a drink at the local pub. Life generally flowed smoothly, maintaining a comforting rhythm that, until recently, remained undisturbed. However, life has its way of disrupting tranquility unexpectedly. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when I observed moving trucks parked outside the neighboring house. It was an older residence that had been vacant for several years after the previous owners, a kind elderly couple, relocated to a nearby senior living community. I had always assumed that house would eventually be listed for sale. It wasn't particularly remarkable, slightly worn, but it possessed that rustic appeal that's currently in vogue. Initially, I didn't think much of it. New occupants arrive frequently, yet something about the manner in which the trucks arrived piqued my interest. This wasn't the typical couple or family. As I was attending to my roses, I noticed her. She emerged from the truck into the sunlight, tall and striking, her strawberry blonde hair gleaming under the clear blue sky. Her attire was impeccable, far more polished than anyone I'd seen moving into our neighborhood before. Before we continue with the story, please consider subscribing. It's my dream to once reach 1,000 subscribers. Now back to the story. She wore a fitted blazer, sleek pants, and heels that clicked sharply against the pavement as she approached her new home. I couldn't help but take notice, despite trying to avert my gaze. It's rare to encounter someone like her here. She exuded an air that suggested she wasn't accustomed to blending into a crowd, leaving one to wonder if she truly belonged here or was merely passing through. Deciding to introduce myself and extend a friendly welcome, I believe in fostering a sense of community. A peaceful neighborhood should at least make an effort to greet new residents warmly. I wiped my hands, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked over to her house. "Hello," I called out, stepping onto her driveway, aiming to appear more welcoming than awkward. "I'm Martin. I live next door. Just wanted to say hi and welcome you to the neighborhood." She turned to face me, her eyes scrutinizing me for a moment before offering a half smile. "Oh, hi," she responded, her voice sharp yet not unfriendly. "Thanks, I suppose." I hesitated, attempting to move past the initial awkwardness. "I've been in the area for quite some time. If you need anything, just let me know. Everyone here is friendly enough." She blinked, appraising me as if I were a curiosity. "Right," she replied almost absent-mindedly. Then she paused, looking over her shoulder before adding, "I'm sure I'll be fine. I don't really have anything on me, you know?" Her odd comment left me momentarily confused. "Oh no, I didn't mean it like that. I meant if you need help with the move or anything, I'm just next door." She dismissed my offer with a wave of her hand, an unusual demeanor settling around her. "Thanks, but no thanks," she said curtly, as if that was the last thing she desired. With that, she turned her attention back to the moving boxes. I stood there, slightly taken aback by the unexpected turn in our conversation. Most people in the area are friendly, even if somewhat reserved, but she seemed different. Her demeanor wasn't unfriendly, yet something felt off, something unsettling. Perhaps she was merely nervous about her new home, a common feeling when settling into a new neighborhood. I decided to attribute it to that and returned to my garden, though I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The ensuing weeks passed without significant events. My life resumed its usual pace. However, a heatwave hit shortly after I learned her name was Shirley from the mailman, who had to deliver some misdirected packages. The intense summer sun made everything feel more pronounced, and I found myself spending most days lounging by the pool with a cold drink, enjoying the slow, relaxed pace the heat brought. Most neighbors embraced the summer by being more active outdoors, except Shirley. She rarely ventured outside. Occasionally, I saw her through her window, moving around or conversing with movers and contractors, but she didn't appear to appreciate the neighborhood's peacefulness. Perhaps she was just too occupied, but what stood out was her tendency to isolate herself, as if constructing a barrier around her life. Despite her distance, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was amiss. I didn't want to judge too quickly, but my intuition suggested there was more to her presence than just being a new resident. In small towns, everyone tends to know, or think they know, everyone else's business. Living in a quiet place like Easton accustomed me to calm, a slow-moving life without surprises or drama. At least, that's what I believed. Suddenly, the peace was about to be disrupted. It was one of those rare moments when everything seems to be going smoothly, until something entirely unexpected intervenes. The heat wave was still in full swing, but I had managed to enjoy a good stretch of time by the pool. The sounds of birds and the gentle rustling of trees made the outside world feel distant. I was content in my personal paradise when the serenity was broken by a sharp knock at the door. I wasn't anticipating anyone, assuming it was a neighbor or perhaps a delivery. However, when I opened the door, I wasn't greeted by a familiar face. Instead, two officers stood on my doorstep, their uniforms crisp and expressions unreadable. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said, stepping forward as I instinctively took a step back. "We're here to investigate a disturbance. We've received complaints about noise coming from this residence." I blinked, trying to comprehend their words. "Noise," I repeated, uncertain if I had heard them correctly. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation with the police, especially since I was merely sitting by the pool, listening to the countryside's gentle hum. "There must be some misunderstanding. I've been in the garden all day and haven't heard anything unusual," I responded, feeling uneasy. The officer looked down at a piece of paper in his hand. "We've had reports of someone making noise, and this address is linked to the disturbance. May we come in and take a look?" A sense of unease settled over me. This was absurd. I had lived here for decades without such issues. Nevertheless, I wasn't about to escalate the situation. "Sure, I'll show you around," I agreed, stepping aside. They entered the house, their eyes scanning the interior as if searching for something specific. I knew there was nothing to find. This was merely a misunderstanding. However, I couldn't help but feel the tension mounting within me. I led them to the living room and gestured around. "As you can see, everything is in order. I haven't made any noise." The officers seemed somewhat satisfied but continued probing. One of them, a taller officer with a stern expression, asked, "Can you prove that you live here?" It felt like an odd request, but I didn't hesitate. I quickly retrieved some utility bills from a drawer and handed them over. The water bill clearly displayed my name and address. The officers exchanged a brief glance before the stern one nodded. "All right, Mr. Martin. It seems there's no issue here." Just as I thought the situation was resolving, I noticed the two officers move past the window, heading toward the end of my driveway. A sinking feeling told me this wasn't the end. Before I could respond, I heard it, a sharp, angry voice from Shirley's side of the fence. "Do something about him!" she yelled, her words penetrating through the walls. "Why are you letting him stay here? He doesn't even belong in this neighborhood. He's a homeless migrant, a threat to our peaceful little village." I felt my face flush with heat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Shirley had shifted from a distant neighbor to openly hostile in just days. She had accused me, Martin, a man who had lived here for over 30 years, of being a homeless migrant. The officers fell silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I stood at the door, unable to move, but trying to remain calm. Arguing would only worsen things. "Excuse me," I said cautiously, stepping outside. "I don't know what this is about, but I've lived here for decades. You've met me already, Shirley, and I'm certainly not what you're accusing me of." Shirley's eyes flashed with disdain as she turned to face me. "Oh, look at you," she sneered. "Don't play innocent. We all know what you are. You're just a beggar trying to take advantage of this nice village. We have no room for people like you, Martin." I felt my blood boil, but I maintained a steady voice. "Surely," I began calmly, "I don't know what problems you're dealing with, but I don't deserve to be treated this way. You've only been here for a few weeks, and already you're trying to undermine everything this neighborhood stands for." The officers exchanged glances once more. Finally, the taller constable spoke. "All right, Mr. Martin, we've checked things out. We'll leave you to it. Ma'am, we suggest you take a step back." Shirley opened her mouth to argue, but the officer interrupted her with a firm gesture. "Ma'am," he repeated, "please." With that, they turned and walked back to their vehicle, leaving me standing there, seething in disbelief. Shirley, of course, had one final jab. "You won't get away with this, Martin. This isn't over." I watched the officers drive away, their patrol car gradually disappearing down the road. The ensuing silence was deafening. I couldn't help but wonder, what had just transpired? More importantly, what did Shirley want from me? This was no ordinary neighborly dispute anymore. It was something far more sinister, and it wasn't disappearing. Initially, I believed Shirley's threats were empty words. After all, she was new to the village, and surely people wouldn't believe someone who was still getting acquainted with the community. I underestimated her determination and her ability to distort the truth. Rumors began subtly, starting as mere whispers. One day at the local grocery store, a normally friendly shopkeeper gave me a sympathetic look while handing me my change. "Hope everything's all right," she said, more as a statement than a question. When I inquired further, she only shook her head and muttered something about things going around. It wasn't long before I discovered what she was referring to. Shirley was spreading the most ridiculous lies about me, claiming I was nosy, unkempt, and a troublemaker. She informed anyone who would listen that I had been lurking around her property at odd hours, making the neighborhood unsafe. It was laughable, except people were beginning to believe her. Her campaign escalated swiftly. One morning, while I was weeding the garden, I noticed Shirley standing at the edge of my property, holding her phone like a determined paparazzo. She took photo after photo of my house, muttering to herself. I stood up and called out to her. "Shirley, what are you doing?" She didn't react, simply waving her phone in my direction. "Collecting evidence," she replied with a smirk before walking away. I thought that was bad enough, but it wasn't until I returned from an afternoon trip to the hardware store that I realized the extent of her actions. She had taken it upon herself to print out the photos she had taken of my house. Grainy, unflattering images of my garden, the pool, and even views through my windows, and plastered them all over the village. I found one of the posters affixed to a telephone pole near the post office. It was a blurry photo of me bent over my vegetable bed with the caption, "Does this man make you feel safe? Demand a safer neighborhood." Below it was a link to a petition Shirley had started, calling for my removal from the community. My face burned with embarrassment and anger. It was one thing to speak ill of me behind closed doors, but this was public humiliation on an unprecedented scale. Worse, it was effective. I noticed a change in how people interacted with me. Neighbors I had shared friendly exchanges with for years suddenly avoided me, crossing the street to steer clear. Some even looked at me with open contempt. However, not everyone fell for Shirley's fabrications. A few neighbors, those who had known me for decades, offered words of support. "Don't let her get to you, Martin," my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Lawson, told me one evening as we chatted over the fence. "We know you're a good man." "Shirley's just seeking trouble," she added. But the support from a few kind individuals wasn't enough to counteract the mounting pressure. It felt as though Shirley was omnipresent, poisoning the atmosphere with her falsehoods. Every time I left the house, I half expected to see another poster or hear another whisper. I kept telling myself to remain calm and rise above it, but the stress was becoming overwhelming. My sleep was disturbed, and every minor noise outside made me jittery. The breaking point came one evening when I discovered Shirley lurking in my garden. I had been inside reading when I heard rustling near the back fence. Peering out the window, I saw her crouched near my rose bushes, phone in hand. I stormed outside. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She stood up, unfazed by my anger. "Just documenting the state of your property," she replied with a smug grin. "The parish council will want to see this." I clenched my fists, striving to stay composed. "You're trespassing. Get off my property now." She laughed. "Oh, Martin, don't be so dramatic. I'm doing this for the good of the neighborhood." That was it. I couldn't tolerate her smear campaign any longer. The next morning, I contacted a solicitor. The solicitor was understanding but cautious. "Harassment and defamation cases can be challenging," she advised. "You'll need solid evidence, photos, videos, anything that proves her behavior has crossed the line." I set to work. A helpful neighbor, Mr. Singh, offered assistance. He had a CCTV camera on his house that overlooked part of my property. Together, we reviewed the footage and found several clips of Shirley sneaking around, taking photos and videos through my windows. One clip even captured her pulling a branch from one of my rose bushes, presumably to make the garden appear neglected in her photos. I also obtained a copy of the police report from the initial incident when the officers visited my home. It clearly stated that there was no evidence of any disturbance or wrongdoing on my part. Mrs. Lawson, ever supportive, offered to write a statement detailing how Shirley had attempted to turn the neighbors against me. "I'll do whatever it takes," she declared. "That woman's a menace." With this evidence, I felt a flicker of hope. The solicitor helped me draft a formal complaint against Shirley, outlining her harassment and defamatory actions. We filed it with the local magistrate's court, along with the gathered evidence. It wasn't an easy decision. Pursuing legal action meant exposing myself to even more scrutiny, but I knew it was the only way to stop her relentless campaign. The petition she had started, the posters, the photos, it all constituted a clear case of defamation. The trespassing incidents, backed by the CCTV footage, further solidified the harassment claim. My solicitor assured me that we had a strong case. When the court summons was served, I noticed Shirley's smug demeanor wane for the first time. She still tried to portray herself as the victim, claiming I was bullying her for standing up for the neighborhood. However, the evidence was indisputable, and deep down, I believed she knew it too. As days passed, I began to feel a sense of relief. The legal process would take time, but I had taken steps to protect myself and restore my reputation. Shirley's lies had inflicted immense stress, but I wasn't going to let her prevail. For the first time in weeks, I sat by my pool, sipping a cold drink and listening to the birds. The calm hadn't been fully restored yet, but it was a positive step forward. Little did I realize, the turmoil wasn't entirely over. The day of the hearing arrived, and although my solicitor had assured me of our strong case, I couldn't help but feel nervous. Shirley, on the other hand, entered the magistrate's court with the same confident demeanor she had since moving in. She wasn't smiling, but her arrogance was palpable. I could tell she believed she could somehow evade the consequences. The hearing began with my solicitor presenting the evidence. The CCTV footage showed Shirley trespassing on my property multiple times, peering through my windows, and even tampering with my garden to make it appear worse in her photos. The police report from the first incident was clear. There was no disturbance caused by me, only baseless complaints from Shirley. Witness statements from neighbors like Mrs. Lawson and Mr. Singh further reinforced the truth. Shirley had been lying and harassing me persistently. When it was Shirley's turn to speak, her tone was dripping with self-righteousness. She claimed she had been acting in the best interest of the community, protecting the village from an alleged threat. However, her arguments crumbled under scrutiny. The magistrate, a stern woman with little patience for nonsense, highlighted the lack of evidence supporting Shirley's claims. Instead, she focused on the harm Shirley's actions had caused me: public humiliation, emotional distress, and damage to my reputation. By the end of the hearing, Shirley's confidence had visibly diminished. The magistrate ruled in my favor, issuing Shirley an antisocial behavior order, ASBO, that prohibited her from approaching me, my property, or making further defamatory statements. Additionally, Shirley was ordered to pay damages for defamation and cover my legal fees. The magistrate emphasized that any violation of the ASBO would result in immediate legal consequences, including potential criminal charges. Shirley left the court in silence, her earlier bravado completely gone. A few days after the ruling, the officers returned to enforce the court's orders. I watched them approach Shirley's house from my garden. Though I couldn't hear their conversation, her reaction was clear. Her eyes widened and she began gesturing wildly, evidently trying to argue her case. But the constable stood firm, handing her a formal notice to comply with the court's decision. She was given a deadline to remove all the defamatory posters she had placed around the village. One by one, she reluctantly took them down, her face flushed with embarrassment as villagers watched. It was a small victory, but seeing her finally held accountable for her actions felt like a burden lifting off my shoulders. News of the court's decision spread quickly through the village. The posters were gone, but the damage Shirley had done to her own reputation was irreparable. People began to avoid her entirely. At the local market, I overheard a shopkeeper telling another customer, "She's lucky she's not in jail after what she did to Martin." Neighbors who had once been influenced by her lies came to apologize. Shirley, meanwhile, became a ghost in the community. She ceased attending events and avoided the main streets whenever possible. On the rare occasions I saw her, she kept her head down, her former arrogance replaced by an air of defeat. With Shirley's harassment finally behind me, I began to feel like myself again. My garden, once a source of anxiety due to her constant intrusions, became a place of solace once more. I found joy in the simple things: pruning my roses, swimming in the pool, and chatting with the neighbors who had stood by me.